All right, good afternoon. Thank you for your attention and welcome to our ERG and Affinity groups, really Passe. So we're gonna take a few minutes with this rock star panel of Silvina, Barry, Patty, and Sumayyah to ask that question and just have a conversation and hopefully give you an opportunity to ask us some questions at the end. So each panelist, as I ask the questions, please make sure you introduce yourself, telling us your organization, your name, and then what your D&I superpower is, because I'm a fan of superheroes, and anybody that's in this space doing this work is definitely a superhero in my book, and I know that one of the best interest points is understanding what those superpowers are. So just to set the stage for this, earlier this year, Deloitte started a major debate in the D&I space when they made the announcement that the firm was ending its women's network and its affinity groups to focus on men. There's been no shortage of think pieces on this on both sides of the aisle, right? There's folks who are outraged, and there are folks who are like, yeah, I kind of get it. So this panel was actually born on a tech inclusion Facebook string. And so some of us were part of that conversation that went on Twitter, and now we wanted to get together and just talk about it. So the first question is, what was your first reaction to the news when you heard that Deloitte was discontinuing its affinity groups in favor for what they are calling now inclusion councils? And I'm going to start with Sumayyah on that question. Would you tell us?
Can you hear me? Mm-mm. It's on, so is that better? Yeah. Okay, great. So my name is Sumayyah Emeh-Edu. I'm a diversity inclusion strategist, and I help companies really put together plans and help solve inclusion issues at their organizations. My D&I superpower is I've done a lot of growth work on myself. I can publicly admit that growing up in Oregon and through my experiences growing up, I had biases towards black people and homophobia. And I feel empowered by saying that out loud, because even though I look the way I am, I'm a mom, I have a hidden disability, I'm African American, I could stay steeped in my victim mode, but I also understand that I too can have biases and have done a lot of work. So within that, my initial reaction to Deloitte getting rid of their ERGs was like, oh no. It was pretty scary. I've worked a lot with ERGs in various capacities, and that was my initial reaction. But once I read further and really looked at the mission that they were trying to accomplish, it resonated with me. I don't think that getting rid of ERGs is the answer to that, but I really feel there is a huge hole in the inclusion movement in not including people who are in positions of power. And by that meaning white, cisgendered, straight men. And I think we can do a much better job of engaging them in these discussions, because ultimately, if you are a minority and belong to several different groups, intersectional groups, you have figuratively and literally less power. So we need to engage those who have power and privilege into these discussions, and how do we invite them into the discussion?
Patty, would you also tell us your reaction?
Okay, sure. Patty Dingle, I'm a senior director on the diversity and inclusion team at Visa. So just a quick plug, please insert, tap, swipe as often as you can to help us out. So my superpower is I always feel like there's a solution to everything. I have that actually tattooed on my arm. There's always a solution. So that's just how I operate every day. So in response to the Deloitte article, I think as D&I practitioners, we have to support the work no matter what decisions companies do. If this is going to work for Deloitte, it's going to work for Deloitte. We'll see, right? For us at Visa, employee resource groups are an integral part of what we do. They're not going anywhere. They're very successful at everything that they do, everything that they touch, but there's a structure to it. We probably will talk about that in a little bit, but at the end of the day, if it works for them, kudos. If it doesn't work, they can go back to the old model, right? So I'm keeping a very close eye on it. I have friends there. There's a lot of folks at Deloitte that are working very hard at this, so I wish them the best. And at the same time, if it's a success, I don't know, we may follow, right? So one thing about D&I folks, we share. It doesn't matter whether or not you're a competitor or not. We always talk to each other. We all know each other. And so at the end of the day, I think it's going to be better for everybody once we work out all of these different types of models, essentially.
Excellent. So my next question, I'm going to tap to Silvina at the end, and can you describe for us what D&I, ERGs, and affinity groups, how they work at your organization today?
Yes, thank you. Silvina Salazar, Bank of America. Primary role, I manage risk, quality assurance for the bank in many areas. My second leadership role, I've been involved in diversity for many, many years. Actually launched the Hispanic Latino employee resource group of the bank. So for us, employee resource groups are the core of who we are from a diversity and inclusion perspective. They're the foundation. But it's been a journey. I have to acknowledge that. I mean, initially, they didn't exist. We had councils, maybe 2005, 2006, where they really picked up. And what they created for us is the ability for employees to connect that have an affinity for whether you're a parent and caregiver, because we have that network, whether you're iGen, we have a network for, the differences in the different generations and how do we help integrate that community. And certainly, your traditional, if you will, the Hispanic, Asian, or Black, what have you, LGBT or women in leadership. But the core of our employee networks, we have a way of creating that connection of employees who would have never connected with each other in a company like ours, right? And that enables them development, networking, because in order to succeed, you got to have skills, you got to deliver, but you got to be connected. You have to be given that opportunity. And how do you get to know yourself, especially when you're growing in the company? They're core to what we do, and I have an opinion about the Deloitte, but we can share that later.
Okay. Barry, would you introduce yourself and describe how D&I groups have worked in the place you are and even some of the places you were before, because we had a conversation about that.
Okay, my name is Rea Williams. My D&I superpower is crucial conversations. I am the person who generally tries to articulate what people are thinking but not saying, at least in a polite manner. Patty could vouch for that. Patty and I were colleagues at AAA in a past life, and I actually served on her diversity council. So she was my first real taste of what an organized D&I ERG looks like, which was great. I would say it again.
Where was that?
At AAA. I would say ERGs and affinity groups at eBay. So StubHub is owned by eBay. They're called communities of inclusion where we are. So it's not necessarily focusing just on being a resource group or a particular group that's devoted to one identity or another, but it is about inclusion. So to the Deloitte's point, it seeks to include those that want to be included in those discussions. I would say, and this kind of links back to your first question, is that I think it actually begs the question, should allies be included in every conversation? Some conversations, I think, are just in and of those communities, and before we come to a consensus within the community, when do you involve allies? So I think that's also an interesting question that sort of structure poses.
Well, and I love that you said that. Would anybody else want to jump in? Because I see Sumayyah's making some. So yeah, and then Pat and definitely Silvina jump in as well.
And I love the name Inclusion Communities. I think when I work with clients, I really teach that inclusion is a behavior, just like exclusion is a behavior. So it's important to look at that, and I know that there are such rich stories that go on within these ERG conversations. I mean, every time I go to an event like this, I hear these things and I'm so impacted by them. And I'm like, well, where are the people that need to hear these stories, right? We have all this data, but it takes our stories to really impact behavior and behavior change. Someone may look at data and make excuses for why that's happening, but if I see someone who's competent, skilled, confident, who is saying that even they have been impacted by exclusion, it's going to make me have some empathy towards them. So yes, I believe there's a space to have that safe place, a separate conversation away from allies where you can be yourself and find community. But I also believe that it's important to have those with the greatest power, position, and privilege to hear those conversations so that they can impact change in where they at, and they also need to learn, right? So I think that's my 2 cents on it.
Yeah, and just to add, so there's a role for everyone. There's a role for the majority as much as there's a role for the minorities. The responsibility is on all, but the education, the awareness, I think that Deloitte is trying to pursue is to say, I don't want to focus on the differences. Let me work with a broader team who has the authority, who's got the power. How do we help kind of try to, get everybody in a more level playing field? I think it's an evolution. Every company, sometimes you start from nothing. You got to start from one point and then build diversity, connection, and then to get to the part of the inclusiveness. You can have a diverse company, but you may not have necessarily an included organization, right? You could have also, that people are not working together and really getting where we all collectively need to get to.
I think inclusion is an interesting way to frame it too, because everybody can relate to being excluded from something at some time or another, as opposed to everybody thinking that they're diverse. Someone may not necessarily look at themselves or identify as saying, oh, well, I have this particular difference, and so I fall within X group. But everybody can relate to being excluded from something, anything, at one point or time in their life.
Absolutely, and I work a lot with government agencies where government agencies tend to be extremely diverse, but that does not mean necessarily that those are inclusive environments where everyone is heard and where people's contributions are valued, because that's at the core of building an inclusive environment. Patty, was there anything you wanted to add?
Sure. So I think, to Bari's point, when you feel excluded, it's very visceral. I think it's also very visceral when you feel like you belong to something. Mm-hmm. And if anyone is ever feeling like they're not a part of or cannot be a part of, that's the challenge. There's a lot of conversation around the cisgender white male, but as someone who is biracial, I can honestly say that the communities that I represent, I feel extremely excluded from sometimes because I don't fit necessarily. So I think behavior, I even think semantics play a big part in it.
Yes.
So if I'm talking about ethnicity in a training, I'm not just talking about African American, Latinx. I'm making sure I'm weaving in people from European descent, German, Italian, because I think just from a semantic perspective, that's an indicator to folks that you're aware of this, right? And I think that as practitioners, we have to consistently do that. LGBTQAI, it's a lot, but it's important. And you resonate. The buttons, he, she, her, him, at the table showed me that this event is inclusive. So it's behavior, it's language, it's all of these things. And if our employee groups do that, I think it creates a better environment for folks to feel like, yeah, I can be a part of that. But it's hard to practice. It's very difficult. And people like me are constantly reminding others to do that. So that's huge for me, is how people feel. How do you feel when you walk through the door? When I walked through these doors here, I felt like this is it, right?
Absolutely. And language, I'm a marketer by trade, so I believe the narrative is so important, right? Because when you think about the external narratives that are going on across our country right now, these discussions internally need to really be robust, and they need to be intentional, because people are getting all kinds of messages from all kinds of sources. Before we move off of the talking about the groups, I wanted to ask, because something came up in our preparation about distinguishing employee resource groups from affinity groups. Because, and Silvina, you made the distinction of, hey, like a parenting group versus one of the traditional groups. Does anybody, I know Sumayyah has an opinion about that. Would you tell us a little bit about, because in companies, these have all kinds of names, right? Some companies call them employee resource groups, some companies call them business resource groups, and it all has to do with what their focus is and what they're setting out to do. So can you give me some insight on kind of the difference between these groups?
Yeah, I think it, and I think Patty has some great information to share on this as well, but affinity groups and resource groups are a place to build community, right? So resource groups often tend to be more of the safe place, and maybe in some cases adding to the business case or business goals. They might do some education to the rest of the company about their particular group's issues or concerns to influence policy. And then the affinity groups tend to be more like community groups, like wellness or parents or things. I think what's important, again, in terms of behaviors, and kind of what Patty said as well, like to be a part of a community feels good, right? Like I'm into wellness, I want to be around other people that believe in that as well. So I think those serve a purpose. I just want to make sure that we delineate, though, between what is a traditionally marginalized group that has experienced oppression. That is a lot different than, for instance, in tech, there are millennial ERG groups. I think there's nothing wrong with that, but I think as well as the millennial in the tech space is not a traditionally a group that has experienced oppression. And there's so much nuance between and hierarchy among which groups are,
It's the ranking of oppression.
Yeah, ranking of oppression. And I don't want to get into like an argument about that, but historically speaking, there are groups that are more impacted. So I want to just make sure organizations are making that delineation so that there is a clear focus on like what are our real goals and what kind of environment are we trying to create.
Yeah. And
There's
throw in a global environment on top of that,
Right.
Right.
I think another piece of that, so you were saying the narrative's important to you because you're a marketer by trade. I'm an attorney. So for me, it's the definition of how we're literally defining things and groups and what are the parameters you're playing within is very important, particularly to that point if you're talking about marginalized groups. There are legal references that you have as to what those groups are, what they entail, what are the laws around the protections or non-protection in some cases. So I think that is a very good call out. And then you also have to think of the intersectionality piece and how do those all play together.
Right. I just, at Visa is a little bit different. The voice of the employee is really strong, and we started a Middle East group. And when you look at how the government kind of defines who we are ethnically, there's no box.
Yep.
Right? They're actually advised to check white. So if I were to look at this data, Middle East does not stand out. It was our employees who said, hello, we need some help here. And we're having conversations now about creating those categories for them, right? It helps that we do business in the Middle East, right? They advise us. And so to your point, the oppressed groups, but for us, they have to be aligned with our strategy. They have to impact the recruiting piece, the retention piece, the development piece. They have to impact the business. If we're working in countries where payments are limited for non-banking customers and they're primarily African, we need to address that. Who's going to help us? Our employees that are from that community. So there's a strong business case as to why these groups exist and even how a group can even form.
Yeah, and if I can add from the perspective, so at Bank of America, we have 11 employee networks. We call them networks because it's a combination of the resource group and the legacy of affinity groups. There's 5 pillars that we work on. The workplace, making sure that it's a safe and inclusive workplace. Community, We also influence grants to give in, for example, in partnerships with Feeding America and where the money goes. We have development, so leadership development, that's an area of focus for them. And also in terms of retention and attraction of talent. And the business strategy is the fifth. An example, one of the things we are able to do and influence through the employee networks was that we needed to have in Spanish our online banking, mobile banking app, and we actually provided the talent for the development of it, right? It came from the employee network. We didn't have it in Spanish. Obviously, it's very strong in English, and now it's in Spanish, and it's fantastic. That's another segment that can actually use it. So there is a business strategy component of it. There's an employee engagement component of it. They're able to, the employee networks can propose where funding of our non-for-profit goes to. They can specifically direct us, for example, to say where we need to be. In Europe, for example, we have a multicultural employee network, because if you go to Europe and you're from Spain or Italy or Germany, it's like it doesn't, the traditional we know here in the US is very different. Right. And in Asia, there are countries today that being LGBT is illegal. So we cannot even have a formal chapter, or they're concerned about coming out from that way. But we create a safe environment while they're at work. So it's very interesting, the whole global dynamic. We couldn't relate here in the U.S.
Right. Absolutely. So I want to, I want to break up this conversation for a second, because as we talk about this work is hard work, it's intentional work, and every person that's been on the stage before, even as they talked about people with disabilities and all the different areas of diversity, it can be exhausting for folks. And so I do want to take a moment to ask these ladies, what are the things that you do to help yourself and preserve yourself? Because this work, it really could eat you alive. And I see people in the audience shaking their heads. That's right. There are times where, especially when you think about the headlines and you think about all the things that are going on, I want to take a moment to hear from each of you, what are the things that you do to recharge yourself, to rejuvenate yourself, so that your creativity around these topics can continue to flow. And I'm starting with Patty. She's smiling. And, and we're going to be supportive of her.
Joking aside, because we were talking about this back then, I said, well, I drink, I have a cocktail every now and then, but, that's just fun talk. I have a lot of fun at work and in my personal life. 11th hour decision, let's go to the Warrior game last night. Jammed down the hill, went to the Warrior game. My family and I actually intentionally choose to do things that we love to do. And on the other side of that, given what's going on in the world, sitting down, having an emergency plan, sitting down, ensuring that there's room in our house for anyone at any time if they need a place to stay. So when we have this amazing foundation of how we're contributing and how we're giving back, I feel like it gives me a little bit of permission to have fun. So it's that balance of ensuring that I'm really a good citizen, frankly, to everyone, and acknowledging that I can't just be at home wallowing over. I don't watch the news either.
It's a great self-care move.
I purposely don't do that. I read a lot. And I catch myself, and I always, again, what's the solution? There's always a solution, and that's how we operate in our house as well.
I would say it feels like my kind of work never ends. So there's work, and then I have a 7-year-old and a 2-year-old. So it's just like a constant 24-hour cycle. And I'm an insomniac. So I tend to run on like 4 hours of sleep. But for me, the way that I kind of decompress is I read a lot and I write a lot. And a lot of my writing is spurred by things that I read or things that I experience, or trying to find solutions. Or trying to clarify or tease out what an actual problem is, so then we can find the solution. I think that's probably my biggest method of decompressing, is writing. And then I love ratchet TV shows.
Ratchet
love
television.
them.
What's one of your guilty
Love
pleasures?
it. Love it. I can't wait for Real Housewives of Atlanta to come back on November 5th.
She's got the date.
I got the date. I'm ready. My DVR stays ready. Yeah, so it's reading, writing, Ratchet TV, 3 R's.
Reading, writing, Ratchet TV. I'll keep that in mind.
3 R's.
It's new version of 3 R's.
Will you tell us your, or, but you're laughing, I was giving her a second.
Okay. So a few years back, there was this learning, and they made us do this exercise. Stop. Write down now, what are the 3 things or 4 things that make you happy? It was at work. I thought, okay. Reading a book, feeling the sun, riding a horse, playing with my children. So I wrote that down on a sticker and I put it on my computer. And I started thinking, listening to the silence was the next one, listening to silence, because there's so much noise, right? And it's not necessarily full silence, it meant detach yourself from all the busyness and the crowded thoughts that you have in your mind. And I wrote it down, I put it on my computer. So every so often I look at it and I try to think about, okay, when was the last time you rode a horse, read a book, or, or just listened to silence? And I purposely try to do at least one of those things once a week to try to, keep myself in check. Having said that, I was thinking about the superpower, it's like, there's a job that you just cannot not do. And there's a drive that each of us have inside. And that you don't stop at the first no or the second or the third, because it's that conviction that takes you to do what you want to do. And I also have that passion and the energy that comes from within that keeps you going and doing. Yeah. So the balance is personal. You do have to stop. I did stop and I listened to silence this weekend, and it just helped me breathe. And I kept going for when Monday hit,
Sumayyah?
So I've been on a 5-week social media diet, and oh, God, it's just amazing. I deleted all my apps, and I push content because I got to hustle for my business. But yeah, that's tremendously helped me get more space. Community is important. I work for myself, so it's lonely sometimes. So I'm a part of a diversity consultants community, and some of you are out there, saw you.
To join that.
So, just going there and getting hugs and being able to talk about the issues we face is important. And then I like to ally for other people. So, obviously in terms of my work, I do it, but for instance, I have a hidden disability. So if I see someone who needs help out in public, who is in a wheelchair or cannot advocate for themselves, rather than get steeped, because I do get triggered because of the work that I do, rather than get steeped in me being a victim or being affected, it helps me to advocate for someone else in a way where I'm creating an opportunity for them. So that's kind of how I manage things. Thanks.
Cool. And I am not an outdoors girl, don't like bugs, don't like weather, don't like any of that, but I have found myself making space because I travel all the time, so I go into state parks, national parks, and local parks, and just be outside and let nature kind of reconnect me, because this work absolutely sucks the life out of me. And even in my life outside, I have children as well, so helping a 12-year-old boy and a 16-year-old girl navigate this world also takes its toll. So making sure, I wanted to take time for that, and I want you all thinking about things that you can do to care for yourselves as you do this work. And now we're going to shift back into the hard-hitting questions. I want to ask, and this one is, what have been some of the successes of these groups in these organizations that you have participated in? And I want specific examples, whether it's connecting it to your business objectives, but give me stories of times that your affinity groups, your ERGs, had an impact. And since Silvina is nodding the most, she gets to go first.
Okay, well, I already told you the one that we did for the language and online banking. Military group. We have a MSAG, our military group, and it was really built by some of the few of our employees who had served. And one of the things I worked on is developing a strategy for which now the bank made a commitment to hire at least 10,000 veterans. We actually give them employment when they come out, and yes, I think it's important. We put in 1,900 homes. We've donated 1,900 homes to vets when they come home, and depending on the condition, disability. We have created when they come back, to have a like an internship program just to get them back into the workforce. So that was driven just by the employee network, bringing it to our CEO and making sure that we have this opportunity, we have this commitment from a country, and it was driven by MSAG. I can tell you that one of the positions I had was based in Costa Rica. We built the LGBT chapter in Costa Rica. HPNS were the first two large corporations to have an official declared chapter. And one of the things that we accomplished is, we provide insurance, health insurance for our employees and for partners, and in the U.S. I mean, it doesn't have to be married or anything like that. Well, that was not common in Costa Rica, so we told them that if they wanted our business, we needed to extend. If our employee had a partner, that they could have the same type of insurance coverage like they had if they were married or not married. So we influenced the market and changed and gave benefit to those who wanted it, whether they were married or not. So those were two examples that I know through our employee networks and the voice of our employees, we were able to change aspects of the business.
Oh, that's awesome. Patty, would you take that?
Yeah, sure. So the folks that are involved with our employee resource groups, they're ambassadors all the time. They're always on. If we're at Grace Hopper, which is the biggest women in computing conference in the world, 18,000 women in computing, I'm making sure that I have a diverse group of ambassadors there that are senior software engineers that could share with that attendee their experience at Visa. And I always tell them to keep it real. But understand that if we bring this person on at Visa, that's your buddy, right? So there's a buddy program too. So whether we just got back from Out and Equal, which is about LGBT workplace equality. We have a senior vice president who is an out gay man. You don't think I don't put him on that stage with his Visa swag on and sharing his story? Because that is a direct way to let people know you could be yourself at Visa.
And being high.
And the fact that he's in the Utah office, right?
Wow.
I do a lot of educating about Utah to Californians. Utah's pretty cool, by the way. 50,000 people at their Pride event. So it's things like that. So we're a business to business, right? So we don't have product we could develop necessarily, or, the product companies have great stories, Pepsi, Clorox, all that, right? We have to use our employees in a way where they're the face of the company. Talk about marketing.
Yes.
Right? Collateral, images, printing, all of that. So they've done a great job at that because they are outstanding performers as well. So we're able to leverage that to recruit, to retain, and develop.
So one last thing before I open it up for questions. Last night at the speaker dinner, someone said to me, I saw that Visa's on there, I saw that StubHub, I've seen some of the names, and those are big companies. I'm in a small startup. We have 100 people in our place. How do we do this effectively? So, Barry, would you?
My mom and grandmother they have really great kind of sayings, and one of them is, do what you can with what you have where you are. And so if you're one person and you see a gap, whether that's a gap in your company, whether it's make a business case for it. The other thing that I always say with people in terms of ERGs or affinity groups, or where you see a different use case or product case for something, lead with why the person that you're asking for help, lead with why it's beneficial to them. And if it's a business case, lead with money. I know that sounds crass to some extent, but in order to get what it is that you want,
everybody's attention, right?
Exactly.
That's the color we all care about is green.
Exactly, and people are going to be more likely to listen to you if you're talking about how much money they stand to gain or how much money they stand to lose. And for me, and that's a ton of the stuff that I have spent the last couple of months writing about is at least for me, my identity as a black woman is what does black female buying power look like? And a Nielsen report came out about 2 or 3 weeks ago about how black women essentially drive culture and consumer trends and spending. And we'll lead with that if you're going to a small company and you want to talk about starting a black employee resource group or affinity group. Lead with how much, that's $1.5 trillion.
Right.
Lead with that.
Use your visa.
Use your visa.
Use your visa when you're spending that 1.5 trillion.
And Bank of America. So I would like to open it up for questions. If anybody has questions for our panel. Yep, we have a hand right there.
Hi. Thanks so much for being here and all of your wisdom. How do you keep your company from viewing ERGs as a pool of volunteers to create grassroots, quote unquote, movements and create the inclusion at your company? For example, expecting a Latinx ERG to make things happen for Latino Heritage Month, or expecting the LGBTQIA plus ERG group being responsible for National Coming Out Day, Pride, and that kind of thing.
I just want to clarify, the question is, how do you ensure that the responsibility for having these events and these sort of inclusion events distribute that responsibility across the company as opposed to have it be the sole responsibility of the affiliated ERG?
Yes, and how do you keep the leadership from the company as viewing
just as a
ERGs
default, like, well, you guys were the black group, so Black History Month.
On you.
Right, here are our volunteers right here.
Right.
So I just have a quick comment that middle managers are responsible for 80% of employees at companies. So inclusion is not an HR responsibility solely, and it's not an ERG responsibility only. The biggest impact you can make is by engaging middle managers who are responsible for the microcultures within their individual teams. Again, people leave their managers, not the company usually, right?
Yep.
So I could be really happy in one business unit, but then have an awful experience in another one. So the imperative is getting middle managers to impact change within their direct support employees. So when you go to companies or as an ERG and go to the leadership and say, hey, this is what we want to do, get a strategic plan together and figure out how do we share what's an issue or a challenge for our specific community and impact the people who have the most impact on it, which is the middle managers. So that is my thing. Get a strategic goal together, pair those strategic goals with the company goals, which measured gets done, and hold people accountable for that. And believe it or not, I have lots of straight white men who are coming to me and be like, hey, I want to help, I just don't know how. So invite them into these conversations, whether it be in a formal capacity or just, hey, we're just going to have a round table to talk about this, and we want to invite people who care.
How do you incentivize, let's say, a straight white male manager who dismisses these things as extracurriculars?
I love it, the panel asking each other.
I'm just curious.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the WIFM, right? What's in it for
That's
them,
what I was
right?
just going to say.
So,
But doesn't that have to come from their manager? As me as an employee telling let's say I am a black, lesbian, woman, veteran, and differently abled, and I'm saying I want to put on X, Y, and Z program, how do I get a straight white middle-aged guy who is not affected by any of these groups to care about that if it's not his boss saying, here's why you should care? If it's not tied to it's not tied to his goals, it's not tied to anything that he's measured by, why would he care? How do you incentivize him?
well, and the data shows that sometimes these inclusion efforts can backfire because people feel threatened, right? That they're going to lose something, they're going to lose power. So it's a combination of both. It's creating the awareness, but the awareness isn't going to impact everybody the same, right? Everybody's on different spots on the spectrum in terms of what their own growth is around inclusion. And in those cases, you have to implement policy. So it is impacting policy on what are our recruiting practices, how are we giving performance reviews, how are we creating equity in literally every point on the stage in terms of us recruiting, managing, and providing leadership opportunities. So I completely agree with you that you could talk to your blue in the face and some people just aren't going to get it, and that's where the policies are impactful.
So to your question, think about it this way. Somebody has got to take the action first. So the fact that they're coming to you, to set up, let's say it was a Hispanic Latinx group, to say they think that it's your responsibility, you're leading that group, you have your committee of folks, to celebrate Hispanic Heritage Month, you take that and you do that. With time, what happens is when there's the support from the company, you will have a structure to help visualize and make sure that it's not just that it's important for this group, but for the others. It's a journey, it's an evolution. If it's never existed before, somebody has to be from the grounds up, bringing it up, taking the responsibility, getting it done, organized, and then negotiate, okay, this is important to the company because of the business strategy, tying it to the business case. What is the benefit for all? And it's just, maybe it's another group, the leadership for women. But take the opportunity, because it would be worse is that they said no.
Right.
You cannot organize and do anything to acknowledge anything that you want that is important to you. We do have companies that do that. So my suggestion is take it, run with it, build it, and then let's look at the structure, how then you can engage HR, LD, whoever is in your organization, it depends on the size of your company, to help create an infrastructure that then can do it for all.
Yeah.
That's what we did
So-
15 years ago.
Can we just grab that one last question? We're
Thanks.
over.
This morning, they kicked off actually talking about one of the questions that are really most challenging, and actually they commented on how middle management in general, and culture are actually the hardest things to move in companies. So I'd actually love to hear from those of you who are working in these structured companies, how more strategies on actually how to incentivize, because we do hear a lot that middle management performance isn't actually tied to some of these cultural values, or they are not tied to these inclusion practices. And I get that there's policies, but policies often still don't get translated through middle management. So I'd love to hear a little more of some of your best practices.
The only company that I know that actually ties it to performance with middle managers is IBM. And as far as I understand, and I think it's an issue around retention. It's not necessarily just the recruitment numbers. I think the recruitment numbers are interesting, but particularly I think in this industry, the number is really retention, because you could have a revolving door of people who come in, last a year, have a bad experience with someone in middle management, leave, and then it just becomes a cycle.
More expensive to get them there. But
Exactly. It's cheaper to keep her.
And
Or
career
him.
mobility, right? It's how you may have representation at the lower levels, but how do you move
Exactly.
them up, right?
Exactly.
So it starts with the top. So our CEO is dead on, and now every scorecard of the executives of the management team and the next level down, they measure their representation beyond the traditional people of color. So when you want to improve something, you got to measure it. The moment you start measuring, people start paying attention. Then you tie that to the performance scorecard, then you see change in the behavior. But it takes years, and it's a cultural change. It doesn't mean that everybody's going to adopt it. And they will be rated. Like, I can tell you, one of the executives told us that this year was the first time he asked for every one of his direct reports to give him their D&I plan. And he said, and I got it one time, and I sent it back. And I got it a second time, and I sent it back. Until the third time, that was the quality, the integrity, what he was really looking for, that they were signing up to be measured against. 3 times. But somebody's got to do it. Somebody's got to be the catalyst for change.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your attention. We obviously could go on and on, but we have to get moving. Thank you so much, ladies, for being on this panel.
Thank
you
you.
for joining us.